A lot of people have commented that Elon Musk should stick with building rockets and electric vehicles, and they're certainly right. So he's reduced the cost of sending cargo to space by about 90% and built one of the world's most popular electric vehicles without spending any money on ads. So indeed, he should stick to his core competencies, and why he decided to dabble in probably one of the worst emerging technologies out there, social media, which does little but waste people's time and convince American youth that the way forward is to become a social media influencer, whatever that is. Why he's decided to dabble in social media, well, that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, if you look at what the media has to say, everything is going haywire. Advertising woes, he's upended the business, no one's going to kill Twitter except Elon. Look at this one from Mashable on the lower right. Elon Musk is running out of options to turn Twitter around. What has it been, like 3 weeks since he bought Twitter? And of course, this classic from some gender studies major over at Vox that talks about how Elon Musk keeps changing his mind and this person making $40,000 a year is going to keep track of that. So watch out, Elon Musk. Now, one individual that has a lot of confidence, whether that's wisely placed or not, in Elon Musk is Cathie Wood of ARK Invest. And we were surprised to see that Twitter is actually the largest holding in ARK's venture fund, tied alongside there with Freenome at 9%. And this had begged some questions from our researchers around whether or not that would be a wise move to potentially. We're thinking about diversifying some of our alternative asset allocations into ARK's venture fund. And the comment was, well, why would you want to do that when they're invested in Twitter? And that's a very good question. So that's why we wanted to dabble into this today. Now, there's really two reasons, if you listen to what Elon Musk has to say about why he bought Twitter. The first is something around the last chance to save America. And I put this quote here. I think that there's some credibility to this. He says, there's currently great danger that social media will splinter into far right-wing and far left-wing echo chambers that generate more hate and divide our society. So I'm an American citizen. I spent half my life outside of America, and it's more divided over there than I've ever seen it. It is very sad because there are people that are so embedded in their political beliefs that they don't want to even have conversations with people from the other side. And I think that doesn't do our country much good. However, you can see that already I'm starting to go down the path of politics, and that's very dangerous. So we will leave that first reason as it is. And we'll talk about the second. Elon Musk says there's a WeChat-sized opportunity. So he's made the comment that the app in China called WeChat does practically everything. And why can't we just copy that app and duplicate it in the United States? So as investors, we're solely focused on the investment opportunity here as opposed to the politics, and it's very quickly become political. Now, when we look at WeChat's revenues, this is a table we dug up that was an analysis of Tencent's revenue. That's the company that owns WeChat, and they have somewhere around $80 billion in revenues. And of that, you can see in this table, that's responsible for their social media activity. So in 2021, $17.5 billion. However, they don't break out WeChat, so they only say WeChat contributed a large amount. So let's say that's $15 billion in revenues. Right now, Twitter brings in about $4 billion in revenues, or at least it did the last time we looked. So there's certainly a gap there that can be covered. Now, we put together this little diagram that points to the value of their most recent financial filing. As time goes on, that information becomes less and less valuable and relevant. At the same time, Musk feeds us information on Twitter, which also provides us with some insight into what he's doing. So there's some sort of equilibrium at which time we can get the maximum amount of value from their last 10Q and the maximum amount of value from what Musk says on Twitter. And we think that that time is now. So here we've looked at the latest 10Q and pulled out Twitter's basic financials. So on the right-hand side here, you can see that the last period that was measured, they brought in about $1 billion in advertising for that quarter and about $100 million from subscriptions. And then at the bottom there, you can see how costs have increased sharply. So whilst year over year revenues have actually fallen, they've boosted costs tremendously. This doesn't look right. On the left-hand side here, you can see the percentage of revenues for each of these cost components. Now, of course, cost of revenue or cost of goods sold, we would expect that to increase alongside revenues. Here it's increasing for the sake of increasing, I suppose. And then you have these other three categories, R&D, sales and marketing, and general and administrative, that have grown quite sharply whilst revenues have not grown. Now, we're going to make some assumptions here based on information that is publicly available. So we know that advertisers are bailing, right? So let's say that Musk's ad revenues are down 50%. We also know that costs are plummeting, so he's trimming overhead. And some of the messaging, if you're following this, is quite funny, especially if you've worked in tech startups or firms where you do a lot of hustling as opposed to fluff work. And he had put an email out that said, can anyone who can actually write code come to this meeting? His frustration in finding that in this tech company, there's very little tech. And in one tweet, he had pointed out these political t-shirts in a cabinet and was joking about them. And somebody responded, an ex-Twitter employee responded and said, with not a hint of irony, my team spent a lot of time producing those shirts. Alrighty then. The head of philanthropy that he's trying to fire in the European Union, and he's running into problems with that. What firm needs a head of philanthropy? You worry about the ROI. We'll worry about which charities we want to give our profits to. And then hopefully he got rid of all the DEI people and their ilk. And of course, the expensive perks and office realty. There's some real interesting videos floating around on TikTok of quote unquote workers at Twitter that seem to do anything but work. And then there's this blue check subscription component that we've heard a lot of talk about. So we did this simple analysis, and let's just go through the before here in this column. So we have the subscription component of revenue. Then we have ad revenues coming from US, Japan. Isn't that interesting that Japan produces such a significant component of their ad revenues? Then you have rest of the world. That's their ad revenues. Below that, you can see COGS, R&D, et cetera, and then their losses calculated based on that. Now, the after column is where we've plugged in our assumptions. So when it comes to blue check revenues, all we've done here is said that according to The Guardian, there are around 400,000 verified users on Twitter. That equates to less than 1% of Twitter accounts, much, much less than 1%. All we've done here is assumed 0.5% penetration on monthly active users based on the 250 million numbers. So brings us in about 120 million. Then we go down the list here. So subscriptions, we're going to assume that doesn't change. Half of USA ad revenues are canned, as we've plugged in there. Japan, that's an entirely different world in its own. We're assuming those ad revenues won't be affected by the activism happening in the United States alongside the rest of the world. And that brings us an adjusted revenue number. Then we can go down here and plug in the cost cutting exercise. And when we get to the bottom, you see that they're actually able to eke out a profit that can potentially pay, or let's say service, the $1 billion interest payments they have every year. So Elon Musk bought Twitter under assuming that a lot of these problems would happen and under the assumption that this company would be able to survive. That's the number one thing that he has to worry about right now, is surviving. Now, when you look at who's using Twitter, this is very interesting. A firm called Kepios, they claim to be independent and used by a lot of media outlets, and they have rich data sets. One of these is around Twitter usage. Here you can see United States at the top, okay. But what we've done here is highlighted every single country that won't be affected by the activism that's happening in America. So if you exclude Japan, they're all highlighted in yellow here, these are all emerging markets, rich places to start developing application ecosystems in. So this quote at the bottom here is great. It says, "Sell to the poor, live with the rich. Sell to the rich, live with the poor." And indeed, that's true. So there's a lot of untapped opportunity here in emerging markets, some of the biggest in the world, emerging markets that Elon Musk can begin to exploit without having to worry about what's going on in the United States. So all that turmoil that you see in the media and on Twitter, of course, as everybody piles in to discuss Twitter on Twitter, all that turmoil is really a small part of the bigger picture. Now, this is a great case study, and when you go to B school, they give you these, and you're supposed to try to figure out what happens based on limited information, and then they tell you after the fact. So if you were to approach this as a case study, you could probably think of some creative ways that Mr. Musk can fill in that missing ad spend. So, for example, there's the automakers of the world that spend a lot of money on advertising. So just in the United States alone, General Motors spent in 2021 around $2.7 billion. They were the leading auto advertiser, and then Ford's behind them spending $2 billion. So there's a lot of spend that goes into for automakers that goes into selling cars. And of course, as you may know, Tesla doesn't spend, and maybe they start to do that. There's some talk of how SpaceX is already said to be looking at ad spend on Twitter. The Starlink global internet opportunity can certainly be advertised. Tesla's Powerwall solution can be advertised on Twitter. So Mr. Musk's little ecosystem of companies can then begin to leverage the ad inventory on Twitter that's being given up by firms that yield to activists. Now, this last part about burnt hair cologne is quite funny. So he had it's just quite hysterical, had come up with this cologne that I guess it smells horrible. He says it's just like leaning over a candle at the dinner table, but without all the hard work. So he says it's the essence of repugnant desire. And it was meant to be a joke, but he sold all 30,000 bottles of it at $100 a pop. And that's around $3 million. Not very much, but just goes to show that this man can sell ice cubes to Eskimos. I guess he's going to start delivering those in the first quarter of 2023. Perhaps just kind of seeing how much he can get away with selling things on Twitter and people's appetite for different things. You never know what this man is up to, but certainly he has the capabilities as a master salesman to start leveraging Twitter to sell even more things. Now, the key metrics to pay attention to going forward, of course, we won't have insight into these, but cash burn from operations, we had looked at what that was before. Interest payments on debt, so what that works out to somewhere around $80 million a month. And then cash on hand, so this is quite interesting. As of the last 10Q that was filed, the cash and short-term investments for Twitter came in at around $6 billion. So if we assume operations can become profitable after $1 billion of burn, then the remaining cash would give them a runway of servicing their debt of about 5 years. So all this talk in the media about how Twitter's end is around the corner and they won't last until next year just shows the ignorance of those who are reporting and perhaps motives other than trying to dissect whether or not Twitter will survive. And that's why we wanted to actually dig into the numbers a bit and try to put some reality around it. Now, when you look at their usage growth over time, going back to WeChat has about 1.2 billion monthly active users. So you can see here that Twitter is only a fraction of that, but look at the growth. So that's some nice steady growth over time, again, taken from their last 10Q. On the right-hand side here, you can see a chart posted by Mr. Musk and a series of metrics he had produced talking about, and this number, as somebody had pointed out, is incorrect. It's November 20. That's probably meant to be 2022. But these metrics were showing how the number of new signups and usage has never been higher. And that's quite easy to believe given the controversy that he's been creating on the platform. So this particular headline here seems pretty fitting from the New York Times. Can Elon Musk make the math work on owning Twitter? It's dicey. Indeed, it is. And he's facing financial challenges. The site frequently loses money. Of course it did. And he took on $13 billion in debt for the Blockbuster deal, and he now has to service that. So just some other bits and bobs here. There's a lot of talk about free speech versus hate speech, and it's now become very political. And I wanted to just quickly comment on that because that even affects us here at Nanalyze. So somebody had made a comment. There's a gentleman that founded Comma.ai, and he's doing an internship over at Twitter. It's quite hilarious. And he seems to be pretty sharp. And he made this comment about how hate speech is speech people in power hate. And the idea there is that once you have somebody who gets to decide what hate speech is, then eventually those who are in power will take control of that and then start to dictate what constitutes hate speech. If you look at Patreon, and we did when we were looking at platforms, whether or not to build out our own platform or to use platforms like Substack or Patreon, look at their definition of what constitutes hate speech. And it's really, really scary. And now you have PayPal saying that if you engage in hate speech, whatever that happens to be, that they can fine you. It's all very concerning. And and we make a lot of insensitive jokes at Nanalyze. We have a lot of fun. We say what we think and we say what we like. And, the question here, if we can take the piss out of the French, why can't we do the same with the Mexicans? So, one joke solicits a strong response from people while the other makes people laugh. So there's a lack of consistency. And what happens is that people start to let their political beliefs dictate what you should or shouldn't say, and that becomes very dangerous. So just to conclude, Musk's first principles thinking, that means he builds everything from the ground up, means he probably thought through the ad spending drop and the operational risks. And for Twitter to thrive, it first needs to survive, and that's why we thought it was important to take a look at that. And of course, we won't know the outcome for several years, and the media isn't helping by creating a lot of noise around that. It'll die down eventually, and they'll find somebody else to hate. But we wouldn't invest in Twitter. It's far too risky. But we also wouldn't bet against Musk. And the last thing I'd say here is that we've been looking at the components of ARK's venture fund, and they had updated those holdings just last week. It's really becoming less and less compelling as time goes on, as they continue to add publicly traded stocks. But what you can do to support us and our work is to just click this button on the right that says subscribe and click yes, subscribe to our channel. And then this video here on the left about finding the next Tesla, I think is quite useful for newbie investors to watch. So thanks for taking the time to watch this today.